All right, well, I'll kind of introduce kind of what we're doing. Some of you were here last time, and some of you I think are new, so that's great. We're going to be doing a lunch and learn specifically for pastors on the first Thursday of the month at 12:30 every week. And so Todd's going to be leading those. Todd is also a pastor and a therapist, so kind of able to meet both worlds, bring them together in a way that's helpful for y'all. For if there's ever a time that you can't make it, we do record these and send the recordings out after. Obviously, we love when you're here live because you can ask questions, it can be interactive, but if you're ever not able to, we can do that. And if you were here before, you should have received an email asking you to opt into our email list. And we do that so that we can quickly get you information about the lunch and learns and what Todd's doing. So if you get that email, we'll send it back out. And for those that are new, you'll also get that. If you can opt into that, we'll be able to give you more information. So I want to go ahead and I'll keep admitting people and I'll kind of monitor the chat while Todd is presenting, and I can make you aware of anything that might pop up in that. And then I'm sure he'll take questions at the end. But other than that, I'm going to let Todd go ahead and take over here.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're able to be here today. I'm Todd. I'm an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And interestingly enough, today is the 16th anniversary of my ordination. So can't believe that it's been 16 years. Since my ordination, I've served as an associate pastor, a college chaplain, a solo pastor, and now I'm currently serving as co-pastor with my wife at Lutheran Church of the Ascension in Savannah, Georgia. In January of 2020, back when 2020 wasn't a mess, I was given an opportunity to come on board as a therapist at Water's Edge. And Whitney, who was just speaking as we got started, is the founder and the director of Water's Edge. And she will also be available during the question answer session to answer any questions that you may have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here and go in. Whitney, can you enable me to share the screen? Okay. So I'm going to share my screen with you and get into present mode. And unfortunately, I don't get to see your faces while I do this. So you get to see mine, and I'll try not to be too awkward as I go through my notes. So here's a little background on why I chose the topic of cognitive behavior therapy for today's Lunch and Learn. In 1993, I was first officially diagnosed with depression. And throughout my adult life, I have sought out counseling on several different occasions. I'm fortunate enough to be able to see a psychiatrist who does both med management and talk therapy. And she recently added an anxiety med to my medication because depression and anxiety, unfortunately, sometimes walk hand in hand with each other. Through the years, I've responded the best to cognitive behavior therapy. More than any other treatment, it's given me tools that I can return to when depression and anxiety seem more intense. Cognitive behavior therapy and its effectiveness is backed by solid empirical data. It is especially effective for depression and anxiety, but through the years, different researchers have expanded that and have begun to treat a host of other mental disorders, even personality disorders, with cognitive behavior therapy. And there seems to be some good research coming from this area as well, showing that cognitive behavior therapy can be effective across a number of different, for a number of different mental health issues. I also thought that it would be helpful because as a whole, clergy experience higher rates of depression and anxiety than people in other careers. I try to do some research on those statistics. They have varied from year to year. But there seems to be a pattern that the prevalence of depression and anxiety is about 2 times higher among clergy when compared with others. So while in other fields we may see about 5.5, 6% of people who report suffering with depression and anxiety, among clergy, those numbers will be 11 or 12%. So that's worth noting. And I have not seen any definitive research about this, but my guess is it's not just clergy. I think these issues of depression and anxiety are also expanding into other church employees. And so I believe that this could be helpful, not just for clergy, but also for those who work in the church in any capacity. So while this webinar, I hope, is going to give you some tips and techniques that you can use with parishioners, I also hope that these are things that you will decide to try out for yourself, that you will learn some different things and that you can use when serving a church is more challenging than joyful. So let's start with a little bit of background. The guy you see pictured there is Dr. Aaron Beck, and cognitive therapy primarily started because of his work. He's a psychologist, and Dr. Beck hypothesized that a disorder in thinking is at the core of almost all psychiatric symptoms. And he further said that if one could eliminate the psychological distress caused by these disorders in thinking or these cognitions, that one would begin to feel more at peace with themselves and in the world. In other words, eliminating cognitive distortions allows us to have increased mental and emotional well-being. By the 1980s, because of the amount of research that he had done, cognitive behavior therapy was being accepted as a useful method of practice, and his work has continued. It's very interesting to me that his children have gone into the same field and picked up his work, and particularly his daughter, Dr. Judith Beck. And much of what I'm sharing with you today comes from a book that she wrote in 1995 called Cognitive Therapy Basics and Beyond. This book is written so that even those who aren't mental health professionals can understand it. It's written in a way that it's very accessible to people. So if you're looking for a little extra reading on cognitive therapy, I would recommend this book to you. As many of you know, with each passing year, we're seeing an increase in those who are struggling with mental health issues. And one could suggest that we're seeing higher numbers being reported because it's becoming more acceptable for people to seek counseling. Now, certainly, it's not as acceptable as I would like it to be. There's still a lot in our culture that tends to lump everyone with a mental health condition together into some group of dangerous people who are going to hurt us. And there are still some people who look at therapists with suspicion. But it is becoming more acceptable to seek counseling. We've certainly seen an uptick in reports of mental health issues since COVID-19 set in. But we're also seeing that many practices are getting fewer calls for those who are seeking counseling. And even some practices are having clients step away for a little bit because they are not interested in doing telehealth. They only want a face-to-face session. So there's this rise, there's this increase because of COVID-19, and yet there are barriers to people accessing the mental health care that they need. However, when it comes to an increase in mental health issues, I find very interesting what Dr. Gregory Lester, who is a psychologist, and this is something that he shared in a continuing education event that I went to on personality disorders. He says that he believes the rise in mental health issues is because we are now required to wear multiple hats. And this is how he coached it, or how he couched it rather. He said in earliest society, everybody had one role. When you went into the village, the blacksmith was the blacksmith, the woodworker was the woodworker, the teacher was the teacher. Everybody had their one role, and that's what they did. But with each passing year, we have been expected to take on more than one role, to wear more than one hat, and that causes stress and anxiety to increase. Just think about what's happened recently. Parents were expected to be pastors and church workers, but also school teachers. And so these multiple hats increase the chances for anxiety and stress to rise. And the reason I think it's compelling is because of the main idea behind cognitive therapy, that disorders in thinking affect our emotions. So I want you to think about all the things you are expected to do as clergy and as church staff. I mean, we've all read the reports that clergy and church staff are asked to do more these days than they were in previous years. That's because the number of people who have volunteer hours available are decreasing. That's somewhat of a move toward a consumer mentality in worship, that people expect programming that they can consume, but we are expected to do more than we previously were. And given this increased caseload, I want you to think about the things that you are good at. When you call to mind the things that you are good at, how much anxiety do they cause you? My guess is very little. But what about those things you question your ability on? With so many different expectations set before us, it's not surprising that there might be some disorders in our thinking. I mean, we all laugh about the things they never taught us in seminary, but trying to continue to learn new skills can be overwhelming. And being asked to learn and take on these new skills also pulls us away from devoting time to the things that we love doing. And when we're not doing the things that we love, our stress, our anxiety, our emotions change rapidly. So add it all up, and it's likely that even we as clergy are having cognitive distortions. For ease of understanding, from this point on, I'm going to start referring to disorders in thinking as cognitive distortions. And in addition, I kind of want to touch on the B in CBT, the behaviors of cognitive behavior therapy. Part of the work that cognitive behavior therapy includes is also addressing negative behaviors. And in a sense, they're all sort of linked together. We have these cognitive distortions that impact our mental and emotional status. And sometimes these distortions lead us to engage in certain behaviors that at the end of the day aren't helpful. And then upon self-reflection, our mental and emotional status is affected because we're kind of beating ourselves up for the behaviors. It becomes a very interesting cycle, and all of it is connected. So now that we've cleared up a little bit of the vocabulary, how do we start using cognitive behavior therapy? Well, first, cognitive behavior therapy works best when you have a connection in place with people. And sometimes we're able to build that connection in a counseling center. But for many of you, you have a relationship in place because you are the pastor or the church employee that a person seeks out. And church members who seek us out for assistance trust us. They trust that we are going to be able to listen to them, to what they're saying. They trust that we're going to be able to help them process it. And so because that relationship is in place, you may be able to gently challenge people or encourage them to take risks, to encourage them to look at what it is they are thinking and how it is they are behaving, and how those thoughts and behaviors may contribute to what they're feeling on a regular basis. So when a person seeks us out and expresses a desire for change, well, what's next? Well, for me, I always like to talk about the big three of therapy. The first one of the big three is a person knows that they have an issue. Now, we all know plenty of people who have issues, but they're completely unaware that they have them. And if a person does not think that a particular behavior or emotion or way of thinking is an issue, no amount of encouraging them to consider it will work. At the same time, we also know people who know they have issues and they could care less. They are content to live with the issue and they don't see any purpose or reason to make a change. The second piece is a person who knows they have an issue expresses a desire to work on the issue. And this ties into what I just said. Some people are fully aware that they have issues, but they just don't want to work on them. This is what I call the devil I know syndrome. The devil I know is easier to live with because finding a new way of operating just feels too difficult or too frightening. And so we're hoping that people will come to us and say, okay, I have this issue and I'd like to work on it. And the third is what I think is the most important. The person has to be willing to do the work. And this is also a challenge because some people say they really want to work on something, but at the end of the day, they are unwilling to do the work. So if you would please repeat after me, we cannot do the work for them. We cannot do the work for them. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. We can encourage them. We can meet them where they are and we can walk with them. We can provide tips and techniques, but until a person is willing to run with those tips and techniques, to try them and to do their work, there won't be a whole lot of change or improvement. When I meet with church members or clients for counseling sessions, I always tell them in the first session that there's never a 100% guarantee that therapy will work. But I also reassure them that when people know they have issues, when they want to work on them, and when they're willing to do the work, that certainly increases the opportunity for success. So all of that said, when we use cognitive behavior therapy, there are two things that primarily happen. First, it's very present-centered. Now, this is not to say that you won't end up talking about past experiences or their childhood. Instead, the initial focus is on what the person is feeling right now. Secondly, the main goal of cognitive behavior therapy is to teach the person to be their own therapist. We are providing tools for them to use over and over again, things that we hope they will draw on if the same issues arise. And this is particularly helpful for depression, because the younger a person is the first time they are diagnosed with depression, the more likely it is that they will experience depression again. And the more severe the first case of depression is, the more likely it is that a person will experience another onset of depression with the same or increased intensity. So when I'm working with people, I often use what I call the hammer example. And what I say to them, every time you hang a picture in your house, you go out and buy a new hammer, right? And they laugh and they say, no, of course not. I go to my toolbox and I get my hammer out. And so what cognitive behavior therapy is doing is giving people tools for their toolbox so that the next time the struggle they're having with mental health arises, they go, okay, I know I have these tools, I know what works, and so I'm going to go back to my toolbox. And so the first step with cognitive behavior therapy is identifying the distorted, dysfunctional thinking that influences mood and behavior. Well, how does a person do this? Well, it starts with very difficult work because it starts with paying close attention to our mood and our thoughts. And this self-monitoring is hard to do. Often, when we feel a certain emotion, we justify why we feel that way. I mean, how many of us have said, well, I felt this way because insert person's name here made me feel this way? Well, that's a good deflection technique. If I can blame another person, I don't have to take a good hard look at why what they said or did elicited such an emotional response from me. So let's get back to self-monitoring. A good way to do this is to especially notice when we have a change in mood. If we are feeling happy or at ease, and then we suddenly feel anxious, that's a great time to pause and to say, what emotion am I feeling? What was going through my mind when I began to feel that emotion? And remember, we're looking for negative emotional shifts, something that feels intense or raises our feelings of sadness, anxiety, fear, those types of things. Now, as a sidebar, it's probably not too bad to also look at positive emotional shifts, because identifying the things that feel good or are helpful to us can also remind us of what to engage in when we are overcome with the sadness, the hopelessness, the anxiety, the depression. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. I recently had a client say to me, well, what if I can't figure out what's going through my mind? And I suggested that he also pay attention to what was happening around him when his mood shifted. Did he see someone that he found particularly stressful or difficult? Maybe he ran into a supervisor who had recently dressed him down. Did he just walk past a room in the house where he and his wife had their last argument and was reminded of the tension that still existed in their relationship? And the reason it's important to look at what's happened or what we are feeling is because it helps us begin to examine our perceptions. It's helpful to remember that our emotions and our behaviors are influenced by our perception of events, how we interpret or think about what is happening. Let me give you an example. I can't see you raise your hands, but how many of you have received criticism from church members? Well, I know that when I do, I tend to have one of three reactions. If my perception is that the person is safe and generally supportive of me, I will be much more open to entering into conversation. This is good feedback, I think to myself. This person is a supporter of mine. I might actually be able to learn something, and maybe I do need to change a behavior or a practice. If my perception is that the person is out to get me, or that they're particularly unsupportive, I find myself feeling anxious. Oh no, what else are they talking? What else are they thinking? Who else are they talking to about this? What if they're right? You know, if only I were better at my job, they wouldn't complain like this. And if my perception is that the person always complains and likes to talk just to hear themselves talk, I feel nonchalant. Whatever. I say to myself, I don't need to do anything with this information. And so my perception of people and events influences my thinking. And in the case of cognitive behavior therapy, the one I would want to pay attention to for automatic thoughts is the second one I mentioned, the one where my anxiety arises. And once we're able to identify what was going through our mind at the time, we're on our way to identifying automatic thoughts. Now, automatic thoughts are difficult because they move very quickly through our minds, and we're usually barely aware of them. We also tend to accept automatic thoughts as true, and this is why we need to pay attention to emotional shifts, because they help us identify these automatic thoughts. And these automatic thoughts fall into two main categories. They fall into core beliefs. These are deep and fundamental beliefs that are often not spoken aloud or articulated either to ourselves or to others. And how do we know if something is a core belief? We know it if we say, well, it is what it is. And here's an example. I have a friend who has a mom that is deeply religious, and this woman experiences anguish every time one of her sons gets married. And why does she experience anguish? Because she says, well, the Bible says a man leaves his family and clings to his wife. So losing my relationship with my son, well, it just is what it is. Her core belief is that marriage means she loses a relationship with a son. We also have intermediate beliefs. These are our attitudes, things like I fail more often than I succeed. Our rules, I must work harder than others, or our assumptions. If only I were smarter, life would be easier. And when we start to identify our automatic thoughts, we also have to look at our learning and our experiences, our underlying beliefs, our coping mechanisms, and our stressors. And this is where cognitive behavior therapy begins to delve into the past. Where did we learn this? How has it been reinforced through the years? Okay, so once we've identified the automatic thought, our next step is to realistically evaluate the thought. And this is called sifting the evidence. And this is done through gentle questions. What evidence do you have to support this? What can you point to in your life that does not support this automatic thought? And here's an example, and I'm trying to use examples from people that I have worked with so that it's not just made up. So I was working with a student who said, I've never been good at school, and so I'm anxious about this new semester beginning. My first question was, well, what leads you to believe you've never been good at school? And he said, well, my parents always told me if I tried harder, I'd make better grades, and they were right. I made B's and C's, and my other siblings made all A's. Okay, well, when were times you thought you weren't good at school? Well, I really struggled with math classes. There was also that time I had to take a semester off for academic probation. Followed that up with, well, let's look at the other end of the spectrum. What evidence do you have that you are good at school? Well, I graduated from high school and got accepted to college. I learned a lot about myself during academic probation and have gotten really good at keeping a schedule so I don't lose track of assignments. Other students want to work with me on group projects because I'm creative and I have good ideas. And that's an example of sifting the evidence. Now, please know it's not that antiseptic. Throughout the process, there would have been moments where I empathized, where I named the challenges that the person was feeling, where I let them know that I was hearing that this was a place of pain and uncertainty for them. And once we've identified the automatic thought and sifted the evidence, now comes the work of reframing. So let's return to the example of the student. First, we would work on not discounting the positives. For example, I would call attention to all the ways that he told me he experiences himself as being a good student. And the question then becomes, well, I wonder how you would own that more. Or it sounds like you believe these positive things are true. So what does that mean? And the hope is that the student would say, well, maybe it means I'm not such a bad student after all. And at that point, we would begin working on encouragement, encouraging that student every time to think to themselves, every time you feel like you've never been good at school, reframe it. Say to yourself, that's not true. I am good at school because, and mentally run through those ways that you just lifted up that you are good at school. Another technique is to have people make a list. The header would be reasons I know I'm a good student. And thus they have something tangible to look at and review when those thoughts crop up. And plus, psychology teaches us that when we write something down, we're more likely to follow through with it and we're more likely to retain it. In a sense, cognitive behavior therapy is like the old telephone switchboards. We're attempting to unplug the negatives and reroute them into positive statements. And here's the biggest challenge. The cognitive distortions are so ingrained, we have to do that work again and again. Most of us will think the thought and then we'll reframe it. And in our minds, we'll hear the voice that says, yeah, but, or you know that's not true. And so we have to fight back against that and keep reframing. And it's not always easy. And it's not always easy for a reason that I find surprising. Interestingly enough, I've seen a trend among those, particularly with low self-esteem or long-held cognitive distortions. And that trend is that they're hesitant to cognitive behavior therapy. And why? Because they only see the other end of the spectrum. They say things like, if I begin to think positively about myself, I'll become an egotistical jerk. I'll stop believing I have things to work on, and the people who have hurt me the most are the egotistical jerks who don't think they have anything to work on, and I don't want to turn into one of those people. Well, if I have a strong relationship built with someone, I will gently say, well, how's the current mode of operating working out for you? And most of them will laugh and say, not very well. And that becomes the point at which I can gently encourage them to take some risks and remind them that I'm walking with them on this journey, and that if I see them making a shift in the egotistical jerk direction, I'll draw it to their attention. So reminding them of your presence is important. It gives them assurance they're not in this alone, and that they are taking this journey toward improved mental and emotional well-being with someone who cares about them. And a great way to show that, whether especially when we're meeting with folks from church, is at the end of our time together, just take a moment to say, did you feel heard today? And is there anything important you feel like I missed that you want to make sure that I'm aware of? So that's the overview of the whole cognitive behavior thing. And granted, it's just an overview. We could spend hours unpacking each step. But I did advertise this as the basics of cognitive behavior therapy and tips and techniques. So I want to take a look at some of the techniques that you can use for yourself or with others. And the first is the cognitive distortion worksheet. If you were part of my last workshop, this one's going to sound familiar to you. For me, though, it's one of the very best. It was developed by Dr. David Burns. He's author of the book Feeling Good. And by the way, that's a book that I highly recommend as well. And this is his cognitive distortions chart. And what I want to do is identify a bit more fully each of the cognitive distortions are. What you do is you identify your upsetting event, and you list your negative thought, and then you identify the distortion. The first one is all or nothing thinking. And this is where you see things in a black or white category. If your performance falls short of perfect, you say, I'm a total failure. The next one is overgeneralization. You see a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. The third is the mental filter. You pick out a single negative detail and you dwell on it exclusively. And what that does is it darkens your vision of all reality. Like when we take a drop of ink and put it into a glass or a drop of food coloring, suddenly all of the water changes color. Jumping to conclusions is one that people do most often. It's when we make a negative interpretation, even though there are no definite facts that convincingly support our interpretation. And it typically falls into two categories. Mind reading is when we arbitrarily assume someone is reacting negatively to us, and we don't bother to check it out. And the other is fortune telling, that we just anticipate everything is going to turn out badly. We assume that that is an established fact. If you have a good relationship with somebody and you've worked with them for a while and you call to their attention that they're doing fortune telling, one way to kind of do that is to say, hey, would you mind telling me what the winning lottery numbers are for tomorrow? And they'll say, oh, of course not. I can't tell the future. And then for most people, the light bulb goes off and they're like, oh, which is exactly what I'm doing right now. Then there's magnification, which can also be called catastrophizing or minimization. That's when we exaggerate the importance of things, that we say, when we exaggerate our own goof up, or when we exaggerate someone else's achievement, or it's when we inappropriately shrink things until they appear tiny. We say that our desirable qualities are things that have to be shrunk down and count for nothing, but that when other people have imperfections, we can shrink those down and those don't count against them. This is called the binocular trick, where we look through one end to magnify or one end to minimize. Emotional reasoning is when we assume that our negative emotions reflect the way things really are. I feel this, so it must be true. Should statements. We try to motivate ourselves with shoulds and shouldn'ts, as though we have to be whipped and punished before we can be expected to do anything. Musts and oughts are also offenders, and the emotional consequence is guilt. When we direct should statements towards ourselves, we feel guilty. When we direct them towards others, we feel anger, frustration, and resentment. And that's why we say in therapy, you've got to stop shoulding all over yourself. Labeling and mislabeling. This is an extreme form of overgeneralization. Instead of describing our error, we attach a negative label to ourselves. Instead of, oh, I messed up, we say I'm a loser. When someone else's behavior rubs us the wrong way, we attach a negative label to them. And mislabeling involves describing an event with language that is highly colored and emotionally loaded. And finally, personalization. We see ourselves as the cause of some negative external event, even though we're not primarily responsible for it. So these are really helpful for people because it helps see not only what our negative thought is, but why it's a distortion, why what we're doing is not helping our mental and emotional well-being. And then there's also the call for positive reframing, where we talk about that thought and we reframe it in a different way. The next technique is one of my favorites as well. It's called the vertical arrow. And I always warn people that it's going to be initially frustrating because it really drives at what those core beliefs are and how they influence automatic thoughts. So here's an example of how the vertical arrow works. Someone comes in and says, I'm so anxious. I got this email and the person who sent it told me I'm doing a terrible job. And the response is, wow, that had to be tough. Why does their comment matter? Well, because they pride themselves on making life at church difficult for the pastor, and they've even bragged about how they have run other church employees off. Okay, so what? Well, it means they could run me off. And what would that mean? Well, I would be unemployed. Okay, so you're unemployed, then what? Well, another church might not want to hire me. I'd be considered damaged goods. And what matters about that? Well, if I can't find a job, I'd run out of money. So you'd have no job and you'd have no money. What would that mean? I'd slowly lose everything, my house, my possessions. I wouldn't be able to provide for my family. Wow, what would that mean? It would mean I am a failure, that I threw away all this money to become a pastor and I'd have nothing to show of it. So you're afraid of failure. Yes, because if I fail, people won't respect me. And that matters because all my life I've had to fight for respect. I've never really believed I deserved it. And when someone disrespects you, like this church member did, it really taps into that deep place of hurt, doesn't it? Now, obviously, this is the perfect example of the vertical arrow. It sometimes takes a bit more digging, but it's to keep people going deeper beneath the surface to find out what their core belief is, like, I've never believed I deserve respect. And this is actually one I like to use on myself as well, that if I have a strong reaction to something and I have the space to do it, I will sit down and I'll start mentally walking through the steps of saying, so what? And why does this matter to myself? Another technique to share with you deals with decision making. Many times people who are experiencing strong emotions have a difficult time with decisions. And these are two very simple techniques. Of course, the pros and cons list, or if you don't like that language, you can reframe it as advantages and disadvantages. And the person just sits down and they write out the advantages and the disadvantages to this new behavior that they're seeking out that makes them feel anxious or worried or depressed or whatever the case may be. I always think it's a good idea to review the list with them, because you may be able to lift up some other advantages and disadvantages. The other technique is problem solving. First, the person writes out their problems, and then they identify what their cognitive distortion is around that problem. Next, they reframe it, they respond to that cognitive distortion, and then finally, they list possible solutions. And as those possible solutions are listed, they then work their way through the list to see if it helps them figure out how to solve or address their problem. And so an example of this, the problem would be, I need to find a job. And the cognitive distortion would be, no one will hire me because I'm not a hard worker. And then you reframe that and you list solutions. Well, I could look through the wall ads. I could update my resume. I could talk with someone who can help me practice interview skills. And then you try those solutions to try and solve your problem. I want to talk now about ABCs. This is another great way to help, particularly with behaviors and with reflecting on them. A is the event, B is the behavior, and C is the possible outcome of the behavior. And so here's a safe example of what it might look like. The event, I get stuck in a traffic jam on the way home. So I have a list of behaviors I can choose from. Well, I can get angry and I can curse and I can beat on the steering wheel and insist that this is just taking up my very important time. And the outcome to that is I'm probably going to have a pretty bad day, or at least be miserable for the next 2 hours. So what's another behavior I can try? Well, I can turn on the radio and listen to music. And if I listen to music that I enjoy, perhaps the outcome is that I will feel more relaxed. Or maybe I could pick up the phone and call a friend and catch up. And the outcome is I get to talk with this friend, and I feel relaxed, I feel at ease. It's nice to reconnect with someone. Now, after we've worked through the ABCs, what was the event, what are the behaviors that we could choose, and what's the outcome? Then we have to get to the D's and the E's. So when you're working with someone and they name a behavior that the outcome has been particularly negative for them, you encourage them to do some reflection. What's your cognitive distortion around that issue? What behavior did you choose? What was the outcome? Did it work? If it did work, then great. They found a behavior that they can use in that situation. If it didn't work, then they try E. They try a new behavior when that situation arises again, and they end up in this loop pattern because the new behavior leads to an outcome. They reflect on it. If it worked, great. If not, what new behavior will I try next? You can also use role-playing and scripting, role-playing with people rather, and I always encourage scripting and practice. This is another place where having a good relationship with someone works well. As they address their fears and their concerns, you have them role-play what might happen. And there are two ways you can do this. If they've told you before the types of reaction another person is giving them, you play the part of the other person. When they make a statement, you respond as if you are the other person so that they can practice continuing to face their fears, practice setting boundaries, practice getting the information they need, etc. The other thing that you can do is you can be them and they can role play the person that they're going to have to interact with. And what that allows is you get to model for them things that they might say in a given situation that feels distressing or has some cognitive distortions wrapped up around it. Of course, the unknown is always how the other person will react. But the goal isn't to predict how someone will react. The goal is for the person you're working with to learn some assertiveness and to find ways to disengage from situations that negatively impact their emotions. And one of the things that you can do is you can encourage them to write a script. They can keep it in front of them. So for instance, a young woman I'm working with is struggling with a relationship with her mom. And in phone conversations, her mom tries to use emotional hooks to steer the conversation in another direction. And recently we worked on writing out this script. They're talking on the phone and the mom says one of her go-to statements, which is, "You just don't appreciate me. I've given you everything and you're a terrible daughter." And the daughter says, "Mom, if there are particular issues you'd like to address, I'm glad to listen. However, I can no longer have conversations like this because I'm hurt by your words." Mom says, "You're just being dramatic." Daughter says, "No, I'm being honest. I will not continue this conversation unless there's a particular issue you think we need to address." Mom says, "The issue is you always let me down." Daughter says, "Mom, I hear that I've hurt you, but I would prefer to talk about specifics." Mom says, "You don't love me. You're nothing like your brother." Daughter says, "Mom, I've asked you to stop. I'm hanging up now. I'm open to talking later if there's something specific you want to discuss." With that script in front of her, she's able to stay on task. She's able to prevent getting drawn into that negative emotional stuff that leaves her lingering with hurt afterwards. And this also works in other settings. So if a student says they're afraid to ask questions in class because they think they're going to sound stupid, then as they complete an assignment, they can write out the question they would like to ask. And when they're called on, they have the words right there in front of them. Another technique is called distraction and relaxation lists. And this is something people can use when cognitive distortions seem particularly overwhelming. Often when one distortion sets in, it's easy for us to start chandeliering. And this was a term coined by Brene Brown that simply put means piling on. Okay, so because one thing feels bad, suddenly everything feels bad. For instance, this might just be a personal example of how I chandelier. I had a terrible day at church and I'm questioning my career and whether or not I have what it takes to stay in ministry. And you know what? I've never liked the way this kitchen looks, and I can't stand this neighborhood that we live in, and none of my friends reached out to me today, and on and on and on. And so to combat this, it's a good idea to make a list of your favorite distractions and your favorite ways to relax. And this list needs to be somewhere accessible so that in these moments, you can go to the list, you can pick one of the activities, and you can engage in it. Certainly, it just provides a temporary distraction, but it also keeps us from perseverating, from repeating those thoughts over and over again. And that's why I said earlier that it might be good to pay attention to positive mood shifts so that we can learn what things feel good or bring us joy. Another technique is Teflon mind. We know what Teflon does to frying pans. It keeps food from sticking to it. And so this is a spoken and a visualization technique. If I crack an egg into a Teflon pan and I turn the pan on its side, the egg's going to just slide right out. So there are going to be moments where we don't have time to devote to dealing with our cognitive distortion. And so when it pops in our head, we simply say the word Teflon mind and imagine an egg sliding out of the frying pan, and we let the thought slide away so that we can deal with it later and focus instead on the task at hand. Another technique is I call it the dreaded percent exercise. Cognitive distortions often lead us to feel uneasy about events and tasks that we have to carry out. And so when one of those is coming up, you take a piece of paper and you divide it in 3 columns. In the first column, you write down the event. In the second column, you write down your prediction of how dreadful it will be. This event will be 75% dreadful. And after the event is over, you write down the percentage that it actually was dreadful. You know what? It was only 25% dreadful. What this reveals to us is that most of us overestimate how dreadful or unenjoyable something will be, and it's usually tied to a cognitive distortion. This council meeting is going to be dreadful because I don't think I'm a very good leader. This first date will be dreadful because I'm awful at making conversation and we'll just stare at each other all night. By keeping this log going, hopefully we begin to see that things aren't as bad as we tend to think, which also helps reduce stress when a future similar event arises. Another technique to use is coping cards. You just need a pack of note cards. On one side, you write down the cognitive distortion, and on the other side, you have several choices. You write down ways you can talk back to that thought. This isn't true because. You write down ways you've sifted the evidence to show that it's not true. Or you can write down techniques and strategies that have helped you. Or you can do one card for each. So that for each distortion, you end up with 3 note cards. And when those distortions come into your mind, you grab your note cards and you use them to help yourself move to a better place. And the final technique I want to talk about is deep breathing. This is simply a good way to help with relaxation all the way around. And what you need to do is get as comfortable as possible and make sure all distractions are out of the way. So you start by just taking deep breaths in and breathing out, and you keep that pattern going, breathing in and breathing out, breathing in and breathing out. And once you get into the pattern of deep breathing, your first job is to clear your mind. If thought enters your head, just let it slide right out. Just keep breathing and focusing only on the breathing. After you've got your mind clear, you start and you keep the breathing going, and you start by relaxing your feet. You do things like imagine the air you're taking in is traveling down to the tips of your toes, that the air you're breathing out is taking the stress and the hurt and the anxiety away. You imagine your feet growing warm and heavy. And some people find that it initially helps to sort of tense the feet up and then to relax them. And then once the feet feel relaxed, start moving up the leg incrementally. Relax your ankles, relax your lower legs, relax your upper legs. Then move on to your fingers, your lower arms, your upper arms, your stomach, your chest, your neck, your chin, your head, your face. And a couple of warnings. You may fall asleep the first couple of times you do this. But it's a good idea to try and commit to 20 minutes every day to practice deep breathing. Because here's what happens. Our bodies begin to associate deep breaths with relaxation. Now, I know some people who have practiced this so much that as soon as they start taking deep breaths, their whole body relaxes almost instantly. And that can be helpful when cognitive distortions are causing anxiety. We can curb the anxiety piece by doing some deep breathing and relaxing, and then we'll be more ready to face the situation or the emotion or the distortion that is causing us some amount of stress. All right, so that's what I've got for you. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute to see what questions you might have about cognitive behavior therapy.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I was trying some of these things with a young lady, and she, like when I asked her to kind of like tell me what her desired outcomes might be, or like what she would want the end goal to be, it was always like unicorns. And I had trouble like bringing her back to realistic. So I would say like how, you know, what in a perfect world, like what would the outcome here look like? And she'd be like, well, my marriage would be happy, and we would already have children, and we wouldn't fight all the time, and we would have a great career that paid money. And I had trouble reeling her back in. Do you have any?
Yeah, I think asking people what is your desired outcome is always a great question, because that helps us help them establish goals for treatment. If you've worked with the person long enough and the relationship is built that you can challenge them a little bit, you could say, you know, how realistic do you think all of that is? But if you're finding it hard to sort of reel them in, you could try another, it fits into the world of cognitive behavior, which is, okay, tell me what level of distress you're feeling right now on a scale of 1 to 10. And if they say a 4, then saying, what would it take for you to get to a 5? What would have to happen for it to be a 5? And then you develop a goal, a short-term goal around, okay, you've said, we know that we can't wave a wand to make all this go away, but here's what needs to happen to get to a 5. How can we work on that? And then when they get to the 5, then you say, okay, what's it going to take to get to a 6? And you keep them moving incrementally in that way toward their desired goal. Even if you know in the back of your head that it's never going to be the rainbows and unicorns and puppy dogs and balloons.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I think that was the piling on. It was like everything is bad, and like there's no use to do this because I can't fix it all. But breaking it down would be helpful. Yeah, thank you. Oh, I have another question. The pros and cons I did miss. When you use advantages of and disadvantages, is that, what are you applying that to? Behaviors or?
More the decision that they're trying to make. If it's, I know that I have to set boundaries with my parents. Okay, what are the advantages of doing that? What are the disadvantages? And that helps them see more clearly what might happen. For some people, that's going to help them weigh if the risk is greater than the potential benefit.
Okay, thank you.
Todd, you're muted. Yeah.
I see that. Okay, other questions? Zoom. Okay, I'm not seeing any other move toward questions, so I'm going to share the screen with you again really quickly to talk through a little bit of the last slide that I have for you. So first of all, thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in this. A few things to share with you. If you attended the last workshop, or if you're new today, you're going to receive an invitation to sign up through Aweber. This is how we at Water's Edge push out information and resources. We're also developing a church leader specific list that I can use, or that the staff there can use, to send out reminders about upcoming workshops. Also, if you live in Savannah, we always appreciate referrals to Water's Edge. There's a team of really fantastic counselors who are able to help with a variety of issues for individuals and couples. And the staff is also available to offer workshops for you. And furthermore, all of our counselors are certified in telehealth in Georgia for the next 5 years. Please like our Facebook page if you've enjoyed the workshop. We also welcome reviews on Google. And we're going to begin a monthly webinar for pastors, as Whitney said at the beginning. And the next one will be on Thursday, July 2nd at 12:30. What I'd like to know is what topics you'd like to hear about in terms of mental health and church work, so that I'm not just picking things that I'm interested in. If you have some now, you can share those. Maybe some of you have commented throughout. But
if y'all want to, yeah, why don't they throw that in the chat here? That way we can, we'll have them.
Yeah, that would be great. I would just love to know what would be interesting to you. Okay. You know, I don't know if this will be interesting to you guys. I also completed a continuing ed event on caring for pastors' kids and the special joys that they have by being theological offspring. All right. Well, we are about at our appointed time. Are there any other lingering questions that you have? All right. Well, thank you all again, and please know that you're in my prayers as you continue to do the ministry that you're doing, and also you're doing a good job. Please keep reminding yourself of that. You are doing a good job. You're doing God's work, and I'm glad to know that there are people like you out there that I can count as colleagues. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.